Hello, chess friends. Thank you so much for being here and welcome back. This is going to be our second exercise from Grandmaster Jacob Aagaard's book, Excelling at Positional Chess, and we have a very interesting position here as well. This is a game that was played in Riga 1995 between Grandmaster John Elvist and Grandmaster Vishwanath Anand. This position is black to play, and as usual, take 10 to 15 minutes to think about the position, analyze it, and understand it before clicking play and going through the analysis with me. All right, so I'm assuming you've taken some time to think through the position and try to understand it, and so let's get started. The first thing I like to do is I like to make a simple observation about the material count within the position. It's one of the fastest and easiest things you can do to start. And right here, I see that black has 8 pawns, white has 8 pawns, white has 2 knights, black has 2 knights, white has 2 bishops, black has 2 bishops, white has 2 rooks, black has 2 rooks, queen for a queen, and of course, both sides have kings. So this tells me right off the bat that the material is even. It's good to know. The second thing I like to do is I like to understand both sides' pieces and what they're trying to do, understand something about their piece activity. So let's start off with the black side. Starting off with this knight on f6. This knight on f6 seems to be well developed to me. I mean, it's applying pressure on e4. It's also protecting the critical d5 square. Aside from the knight on f6, we also see that the bishop on b7 is well developed. It's actually x-raying this pawn on e4, applying pressure on it indirectly, as well as sort of defending this d5 pawn. The only problem for the bishop is actually this knight on c6, which is obstructing its view, which is very important to know. The queen on d8, on the other hand, is also protecting the pawn on d5, but it's also taking the place of the rook on a8, which could be better developed, say possibly on the d8 square. So that's also something good to know. The rook on e8 is doing a fantastic job applying an x-ray sort of pressure on this queen on e2, and it's also protecting the pawn on e5. And finally, the bishop on f8. While it isn't necessarily attacking anything right now, it can be developed to squares such as d6 and c5 in the future. Moving on towards white's side, we see that the knight on f3, again, seems to be well developed, applying critical pressure on e5. Aside from the knight on f3, we see the knight on f1. While it is sitting at home, it looks to get more into the action, possibly by going to squares like e3 or g3. From e3, it can actually target squares like d5, or it could jump to squares like f5. Now, aside from the knight on f1, we see that the bishop on b3 is also applying critical pressure on d5, and it's x-raying this long diagonal looking to attack the f7 square as well. The rook on d1 seems to be well placed, putting some sort of x-ray sort of pressure, just like black's rook was, on the d file and towards black's queen. And finally, we see that the white bishop, the white rook, they aren't necessarily developed, so their position can certainly be improved. Now that we understand something about the piece activity and what's going on for both sides, let's try to understand where the action's taking place, what squares are critical targets. So the first thing that jumps out to me is this d5 pawn, right? This is being attacked by white's bishop. This is going to be defended by black's knight and queen, and it's being attacked by white's pawn. White's knight is also having ideas of moving to e3 to apply pressure on d5. And yet, the only thing that's really a problem in black's position is this knight on c6, which is obstructing this bishop's view of defending this pawn. And so if the knight is the problem in this position in terms of obstructing black's view from defending this pawn, that begs the question, well, is the knight really well placed? And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, then the answer is no. The knight isn't well placed. There should be a better square for this knight. And so, given what's happening in this position, you notice that right off the bat, black is applying pressure on e4, right, through the use of the knight, the x-ray attack on the bishop, as well as the pawn. And we see that white's bishop on b3 is undefended. So is there a square for black's knight to move to where it can apply pressure on e4 as well as sort of exploit this undefended bishop vulnerability as we see it? And there is one square. It's c5. And that comes straight to mind once we observe these characteristics of the position. And so the next question comes quite obviously, well, how do we get the knight to c5? And that's very simple. The most obvious plan is to play knight to b8, knight to d7, and knight to c5. Simple. And actually, that's what happens in the game. Vishwanath Anand continues to play knight to b8, right? Looking to reroute the knight to d7, eventually to c5, where it can put pressure on e4 and b3. White continues here by actually playing knight to e3, just like White's plan was to apply pressure on d5. Now, it is important to note that instead of playing knight to e3, White could have also played knight to g3 here, trying to look for this f5 square, but this actually is counterproductive to White's original plan, which was to try to centralize the knight, right, and apply pressure on d5. Playing knight to g3 also allows black to play with ideas such as c5, where black is going to gain very strong control over the center. So going back to the game, white continues with knight to e3. Black wastes no time. The d5 pawn is under pressure. Black plays d takes e4 right away. White continues with d takes e4, opening up the d file, looking for pressure on black's queen. Of course, in order to stop this and not to lose the queen, black plays knight to d7, going right through with the plan, as well as stopping the threat. And here white plays knight to d5. An alternative to this move could have been to play something like knight to h4. While this does lose a pawn with bishop takes e4, it does give white serious compensation with knight h to f5. Here you can see this white knight on f5 is attacking critical squares like h6 and g7. And we see that white has compensation in the form of this long bishop x-raying this black king. And we also see that this white rook on d1 has tremendous pressure on the d file. But of course, Grandmaster John Elvis does not opt for this, plays knight to d5 instead, centralizing the knight on the strong d5 square, and black simply continues with their plan, knight to c5. I think it's really fascinating to note that once you have a very strong positional chess plan and strategy, all your moves seem to come naturally. Black hasn't done anything complicated. In fact, all three of their moves have simply followed through with their original plan. And now the black knight applies pressure on e4, as well as this knight and this bishop looking to apply pressure as well. And the white bishop on b3 is being attacked as well. Now, this brings into mind something that Grandmaster Jacob Aagard mentions in his book, which is that if you choose a very sound positional chess strategy in accordance of the position, 90% of the time, the tactics in that position will work out as well. And that makes perfect sense here because one of the first tactics that jumps out to me is what happens if white plays knight to b6. And so let's look at that. If white plays knight to b6 in this position, black can simply counter by playing knight takes b3. And if white plays rook takes d8, black plays rook a takes d8. And here the knight on b6 is under pressure. The rook on a1 is under pressure. The pawn on e4 is also under pressure. White is losing this position. Of course, let's go back. If instead of playing knight to b6, if white plays bishop to a2 instead, well, after bishop to a2, black has a simple response, bishop to d6, and all of the problems along the d file are now resolved. Okay, so going back to the game, after knight to c5, white actually plays knight takes f6, okay? And after queen takes f6, I think it's very clear to see that black is simply doing much better in this position. Black has gotten everything they wanted through with their plan. The e4 pressure with the strong bishop on b7, the knight is attacking e4, the bishop on b3 is also undefended and under attack. The queen on d8 has now left the d8 square, has gone to a better position, and given room for this rook to come to d8 as well. Black is doing great. And here, white is forced to move back. Naturally, white plays bishop to c2. And to deliver a nice decisive blow to white's center, black continues with queen to c6. Now you can see that black does seriously have a nice advantage here. The knight, the queen, the bishop, all targeting this central e4 square. And white's pieces remain quite inactive and passive. Now it is important to note that white could force a draw here with rook to d5, followed by playing queen f6, rook to d1, trying to go for a repetition. But in the game, Grandmaster Elvis actually opts for playing rook to e1, defending the pawn on e4. And I think at this point, black just has a really nice advantage. If you look at black's pieces, they're all very active. The black rook is coming to d8. White's pieces are quite passive. The rook on a1 isn't doing anything. The bishop on c1 is still on its starting square, hasn't done really anything. Bishop, queen, and rook all stuck defending the pawn on e4. Black is better, and black does go on to win. All right, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed that, please do like and subscribe, and stay tuned for our next exercise.